At my wife's funeral, the gravedigger pulled me aside. His voice was low, barely a whisper over the sound of the pouring rain. "Sir, your wife paid me to bury an empty coffin." I stared at him, the cold rain soaking through my dark wool suit. I thought he had lost his mind. I told him that was not funny. Without another word, he slipped an old rusted brass key into my trembling hand. He looked around nervously and whispered, "Do not go home. Go to room 13, now." When I finally opened the door to room 13, I froze at what I saw. If you have ever had the people you love most look you in the eye and lie to your face, hit the like button. Subscribe to the channel so you do not miss my upcoming life stories, and tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is right now. Because the betrayal I uncovered at my wife's funeral almost destroyed my entire life until I decided to destroy them first. My name is Harrison Cole. I am 70 years old, and I spent my life building a real estate empire. I worked 80-hour weeks. I sacrificed my own comfort so my family would never know what it meant to struggle. On that freezing Tuesday, I stood before a polished casket, believing I was burying my wife of 40 years. Beatrice had supposedly died in a horrific car fire just days earlier. The casket was closed. The authorities had told me the damage was too severe for a viewing. I stood by that open grave, feeling an overwhelming weight on my chest. I thought my life was practically over. I thought the woman who had stood by my side through decades of marriage was gone forever. But as the priest delivered his final prayer, I looked across the wet grass. I looked at my son Derek. He is a venture capitalist, chasing a lifestyle he cannot afford. I had bailed him out of debt more times than I care to admit. Standing next to him was his wife, Monica. She is an interior designer who cares more about zip codes than human beings. They were standing together under a large black umbrella. I watched my son closely. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Derek was not crying. His face did not hold the hollow look of a man who had just lost his mother. Instead, he looked restless. He looked like a man waiting for a delayed flight. Every few minutes he pulled back his sleeve to check the heavy gold Rolex on his wrist. It was a watch I had bought for him on his 30th birthday. He leaned down and whispered something into Monica's ear. I focused my attention on them. The wind shifted, carrying their hushed voices across the open grave. I heard Derek mutter the words, "payout timeline." Monica nodded sharply, checking her phone under the umbrella. She whispered back, telling him to just play along until the settlement clears. My heart skipped a beat. Settlement. Payout timeline. We were standing feet away from the woman who gave him life, and he was checking his watch, calculating a payout. Not a single tear fell from his eyes. No shared glances of grief. Just cold, calculated impatience. My intuition, the same sharp instinct that had kept me alive in the cutthroat real estate business for 40 years, started screaming at me. A deep, sinking feeling settled in my stomach. The service concluded. The wealthy guests offered their hollow condolences and hurried back to their luxury cars to escape the rain. Derek and Monica approached me. Derek placed a rigid hand on my shoulder. He told me they were heading back to the estate for the catered reception and that I should ride with them. I told him I needed a moment alone. I needed to stay behind and say a proper goodbye. He did not argue. He actually looked relieved. He grabbed his wife and sprinted to his car. I was left standing alone in the rain, staring at the polished wood of the closed casket. That is when I heard heavy footsteps on the wet gravel behind me. It was Vernon, the cemetery groundskeeper. He wore a rain slicker covered in mud. He walked right up to me, looking over his shoulder. He stood uncomfortably close. He took a deep breath, wiping the rain from his face. He said, "Mr. Cole, your wife paid me to bury an empty coffin." The words did not make sense. I told him to get away from me before I called the police. But Vernon did not flinch. He said she promised me $50,000 in cash to seal a coffin full of heavy sandbags and keep my mouth shut. She paid $10,000 up front, saying her son would deliver the rest. But he just laughed in my face. I am giving you the truth because they tried to play me. He pressed a rusted brass key into my palm. The faded tag read Starlight Motel Room 13. He stepped back, the rain dripping from his chin. Do not go home, he whispered. Go to room 13, now. Vernon walked away into the fog. I stood frozen, the key burning my hand. I slowly walked back to my car. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text message from Derek asking if I was on my way to the house. I read the message, feeling a violent shift in my blood. The heavy, paralyzing grief I had felt all week completely evaporated. It was instantly replaced by a cold, sharp adrenaline. My hands stopped shaking. My mind became crystal clear. I started the engine and put the car in drive. I did not turn toward my estate. I drove toward the highway. I gripped the steering wheel tightly. What is waiting for me in room 13? My phone suddenly vibrated against the expensive leather center console of my car. Another text from Derek. Dad, everyone is waiting for you. The caterers are already serving the appetizers. Where are you? I glanced down at the glowing screen for just a single second before turning my phone on silent and tossing it onto the passenger seat. I was absolutely not going to the reception. I was not going to stand in my own home surrounded by wealthy acquaintances drinking scotch and pretending to mourn a woman who might not even be in that expensive mahogany box. I pressed my foot down on the accelerator. The heavy tires sliced through the puddles. The wipers beat back and forth in a hypnotic rhythm, clearing the relentless rain. I drove away from the manicured cemetery. I drove far away from the affluent neighborhoods I had called home for 30 years. I steered my car toward the desolate edge of the city limits, heading into the forgotten industrial district where the buildings were crumbling and the neon signs flickered against the gray sky. As the familiar skyline faded in my rearview mirror, a bitter wave of reflection washed over me. I built my commercial real estate fortune completely from nothing. 40 years ago, I was laying heavy bricks and pouring wet concrete, working grueling 80-hour weeks until my hands were raw. I missed holidays. I missed quiet evenings at home. I sacrificed the best years of my youth to build an empire from the dirt up. I did it all for my family. I did it so Beatrice could live in a mansion with imported Italian marble floors. I did it so Derek would never know the suffocating grip of poverty. I gave my son a life of absolute luxury. Private boarding school tutors, expensive luxury cars, elite university tuition. I handed him the world on a silver platter. And what was the result? I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The final result was a son who stood over his own mother's open grave checking his Rolex, whispering quietly about a payout timeline. I realized in that cold car I had not raised a strong man. I had blindly raised an entitled, greedy, and ungrateful parasite. I had shielded him from every hardship, and in doing so I stripped away his humanity. He viewed me not as a father, but as a walking bank account. And Beatrice, my beautiful, devoted wife, the woman I trusted with my entire soul. If what the gravedigger said was true, she had conspired with the boy I raised to deceive me in the most grotesque way imaginable. The pain in my chest was sharp, but the anger was sharper. It focused my mind completely. The GPS navigated me down a cracked, pothole-ridden street. Through the heavy rain, I saw the glowing, half-broken sign of the Starlight Motel. It was a truly run-down, miserable, and utterly forgotten place. A seedy establishment that charged by the hour, surrounded by a rusted fence and tall, overgrown weeds. It was a place where desperate people went to hide, to disappear, to conduct their dirty business in the shadows. I quietly parked my car at the far, dark end of the empty lot, away from the flickering glow of the main office. The rain hammered against the roof as I sat staring through the wet glass at the row of faded green doors. I stepped out into the storm, the icy water soaking my shoulders. I walked along the cracked concrete walkway. Room 10, room 11, room 12. I finally stopped in front of room 13. The green paint was peeling off the rotting wood. The numbers were barely visible. I looked down at the heavy rusted brass key in my hand. It felt cold and foreign against my skin. I slid the key into the lock. It resisted at first. I jiggled the metal, forcing the pins into place until I heard a heavy click. I slowly turned the knob and pushed. The old door stuck stubbornly against the swollen, warped frame. I threw my shoulder against the wood, shoving it open with a loud creak. I stepped inside and pulled the door shut, plunging myself into the dark, suffocating silence of the room. The stale air inside was heavy, cold, and stagnant. But the darkness was not the first thing that hit me. It was the overpowering smell. It was unmistakable. It bypassed all logic and hit me straight in the heart. It was Chanel No. 5. It was Beatrice's exclusive signature perfume, the exact scent she had worn every single day for the last 40 years. It was so strong it felt as though she was standing right next to me in the dark. My breath caught in my throat. A dead woman does not book a cheap motel room. A dead woman does not leave the lingering scent of expensive French perfume in a place like this. I felt along the damp wall until my fingers brushed against a plastic switch. I flicked it upward. A harsh, flickering fluorescent light buzzed to life from the open bathroom door, casting long, eerie shadows across the faded carpet. The motel room was sparse. I noticed a cheap television bolted securely to the wall, a single broken wooden chair, but my eyes immediately locked onto the bare, unmade mattress in the center of the room. Resting right in the middle of the wrinkled, stained bedsheets was a large black duffel bag. It was completely out of place in this miserable room. It was made of premium leather, the kind Beatrice always bought for her weekend getaways. My heart began to hammer a relentless rhythm against my ribs. I slowly walked toward the bed, my wet shoes squeaking softly against the floorboards. I stood over the black bag looking at the silver zipper. I slowly reached my hand forward, my old fingers trembling slightly as I firmly grasped the cold metal. What exactly did the dead woman leave behind for me to find? I pulled the silver zipper across the premium leather, the metallic teeth giving way with an expensive sound that felt entirely out of place in this decaying room. The heavy fabric peeled open, revealing the dark interior of the duffel bag. My eyes locked onto a small, clear plastic evidence bag resting on top of a pile of clothes. Inside the plastic was a piece of jewelry. I picked it up, my fingers numb. It was a platinum diamond ring, heavily scorched and partially melted, the brilliant stone clouded by extreme heat. It was Beatrice's wedding ring. The very ring I had placed on her finger 40 years ago in a small church in downtown Chicago. The authorities told me they had recovered it from the wreckage of the burnt vehicle, handing it over to my son just 3 days ago. Yet here it was, abandoned in a cheap motel room. I set the ring down on the mattress. My hands moved deeper into the bag, brushing past a collection of designer clothing. My fingers hit something stiff and rectangular. I pulled out a thick stack of small booklets bound by a rubber band. Passports. 4 distinct, high-quality United States passports. I flipped open the dark blue cover of the first one. A cold shiver raced down my spine. Staring back at me from the glossy photo page was the face of my wife, Beatrice, but the name printed beside her photograph was entirely different. Barbara Collins. Every single passport bore the same name, the same photograph, but different issue locations and entry stamps. She'd been building a completely separate, untraceable identity for years right under my nose. I dropped the passports back into the bag, my mind struggling to process the depth of this deception. As I reached into the very bottom of the bag, my hand grazed a cold, flat surface. It was a silver tablet, an iPad. Beatrice had always been notoriously forgetful with her electronics, constantly leaving her phone or tablet behind in hotel rooms and airport lounges. This fatal flaw, her sheer carelessness, was sitting right in the palm of my hand. I pressed the small button on the side. The screen illuminated the dim motel room with a blinding white light, prompting me for a numeric passcode. I stared at the blank entry fields. My wife had always used the same sequence of numbers for everything. I slowly typed the year of our wedding. Incorrect passcode. I typed her own birth year. Incorrect passcode. A heavy sense of realization washed over me. I thought of the man standing by the grave today, checking his expensive watch. I thought of the center of her universe. I carefully typed the 6 digits of Derek's birthday. The screen immediately unlocked, greeting me with a vibrant, colorful home screen. My hands were shaking so violently that I nearly dropped the heavy device onto the floor. I took a deep, steadying breath and tapped the green icon for the messaging application. The application opened instantly. The most recent conversation was a group chat labeled with a simple house emoji. The participants were listed at the top of the screen: Beatrice, Derek, and Monica. I began to read the messages, my eyes scanning the blue and gray text bubbles. The words on the glowing screen painted a picture of pure, unadulterated evil. Beatrice was not dead. She had never been in that car. She had staged the entire fiery accident to permanently disappear. The messages were a meticulous, chronological record of their conspiracy. I scrolled back to a conversation from just 2 weeks ago. Derek had written a detailed update to his mother. He told her the forensic team bought the dental records we swapped, and the coroner signed off on the remains. "You are officially deceased." Beatrice replied with a champagne glass emoji, writing back that she was exhausted from staying in the downtown luxury condo, but the waiting would be worth it. Monica chimed in next, reminding them to stay focused. She wrote that the insurance adjusters were processing the final paperwork for the key person policy. $12 million. The exact amount of a corporate life insurance policy my real estate firm had taken out on Beatrice decades ago when she served as my primary business partner. $12 million tax-free, payable to the survivorship trust controlled by Derek. They had orchestrated a spectacular, devastating fraud to rob my company and vanish with the wealth I had spent a lifetime accumulating. I read through their casual, heartless exchanges. They joked about the catering menu for the funeral. They mocked the tears of our family friends. They complained about the rain. Every word was a razor blade slicing through 40 years of memories, 40 years of trust, 40 years of what I believed was unconditional love. I was a man entirely surrounded by monsters wearing the faces of my family. But the sheer horror of their insurance fraud was quickly eclipsed by something much darker. As I swiped down the smooth glass screen to read the most recent messages, the tone of the conversation shifted. The $12 million was merely the beginning of their plan. It was just phase 1. The insurance money was the capital they needed to execute their ultimate objective. I stared at a lengthy message sent by Monica just hours before the funeral service began. She outlined a precise, terrifying schedule. I felt the air leave my lungs as I read her words. The insurance fraud was designed to fund Phase 2, and Phase 2 involved me directly. They were not planning to take the $12 million and run away to a tropical island. They were planning to stay. They needed total, undisputed control over my entire real estate empire, my personal liquid assets, and my private estate. I read the final message in the thread sent by my son. What exactly are they planning to do to me? I continued to swipe down the smooth glass screen of the tablet, my thumb hovering over the glaring digital proof. My eyes devoured every single calculating word of their toxic, ongoing conversation. The messages grew increasingly callous and sinister. Monica had sent a long paragraph complaining bitterly about my presence at the estate. She typed that my stubbornness was becoming unbearable, whining that I refused to let her redecorate the main dining room, and that my lingering presence in the house was disrupting her social life. She referred to me as an outdated fossil who was simply taking up space. It was nauseating to see how quickly they had discarded my humanity, viewing me not as a grieving husband or a loving father, but as a minor inconvenience. I scrolled down to see Derek's response, sent just hours before the funeral service began. This was the message that froze the blood in my veins. It was a perfectly laid, inescapable trap, a deeply calculated strike against my personal freedom and dignity. Derek replied with chilling, terrifying efficiency. He told his wife to remain patient just a little longer. He wrote that once the $12 million insurance settlement officially clears the bank, they would execute the final step. We will get Dr. Aris to sign the medical papers declaring the old man legally senile. We will permanently lock him in the Pine Haven Memory Ward by the end of the month and take absolute total control of the massive estate. I stared at the glowing blue text bubble. Pine Haven. It was a notoriously strict high-security facility for patients with severe cognitive decline. A place where the doors are locked from the outside and the patients are pumped full of heavy sedatives until they quietly fade away. They were not just planning to steal my money. They were planning to steal my mind, my autonomy, my very existence. They were actively going to bury me alive in a sterile, heavily medicated white room and throw away the key forever. At that exact moment, a profound shift occurred within me. The crushing grief that had suffocated me for the past week instantly evaporated. I did not break down crying. I did not fall to my knees in despair. 40 years of marriage, decades of fatherhood, and a lifetime of shared memories dissolved into nothingness, replaced by a pure, absolute, and terrifyingly cold rage. The frail, clueless old man they thought I was simply ceased to exist. I was no longer a grieving widower mourning the tragic loss of his beloved wife. I was a seasoned, fiercely battle-tested predator who had spent his entire adult life outsmarting the most ruthless, cutthroat competitors in the corporate real estate world. My family had made a fatal miscalculation. They had arrogantly assumed my unconditional love for them, made me weak, totally blind, and easily manipulated for their own personal financial gain. I knew I could not let my emotions dictate my actions. If I confronted them now with nothing but accusations and rage, they would immediately accelerate their plan. They would call their corrupt doctor tonight, claim I was having a violent psychotic break fueled by grief, and have me institutionalized before the sun came up. I needed to be incredibly strategic. I needed to carefully build an absolutely ironclad, undeniable legal case that would utterly and completely destroy them in front of a judge. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I opened the camera application and began photographing the tablet screen. I meticulously documented every single text message, every date stamp, every admission of fraud, and every detail of their conspiracy. I methodically took dozens of crystal-clear high-resolution pictures, ensuring that the undeniable damning proof of their coordinated crimes was safely and securely stored deep within my personal device. Once I had captured everything, I closed the messaging application and locked the tablet. I carefully placed the device back into the dark leather duffel bag, positioning it exactly where I had found it. I returned the stack of fake passports and the melted wedding ring to their precise locations. I slowly pulled the heavy silver zipper completely closed carefully, leaving the unmade bed and the dark room looking entirely and completely undisturbed by my unexpected secret presence. I turned off the harsh bathroom light, stepped out of room 13, and pulled the heavy green door shut until the rusted lock clicked into place. I walked back to my parked car through the dark, relentless, freezing storm. The heavy rain continued to fall in punishing icy sheets, completely washing away any lingering, pathetic trace of the vulnerable man I used to be just hours ago. I sat behind the steering wheel in the dark, the engine humming quietly as the heater struggled to push away the cold. I gripped the leather wheel, staring out through the wet windshield at the flickering neon sign of the motel. I had the evidence of their betrayal securely in my pocket, but the hardest part of this nightmare was just beginning. I had to drive back to my $4 million estate. I had to walk through the grand front doors and sleep under the exact same roof as the son and daughter-in-law, who were actively plotting to lock me in an asylum. I would have to look them in the eye, listen to their false condolences, and accept their fake embraces. The urge to wrap my hands around my son's throat was almost overwhelming, but I knew I had to maintain absolute discipline. I had to continue playing the role of the broken, defeated, and clueless old widower, while I secretly engineered their complete and total destruction. I finally put the quiet car in drive and slowly pulled out of the dark, muddy parking lot, heading steadily back toward the sprawling, wealthy, and treacherous suburbs. How will I face the monsters in my own home without giving myself away? The massive wrought iron gates of my private estate slowly swung open, welcoming me back into the luxurious prison my home had suddenly become. I drove my car up the long, winding driveway, the bright headlights sweeping across the perfectly manicured lawns and the towering stone facade of the $4 million house I had built for my family. The relentless rain was finally beginning to slow, reduced to a quiet, steady drizzle against the thick windshield. I put the heavy car in park and took a deep, steadying breath. It was time to perform. It was time to put on the mask of a completely shattered man. I let my broad shoulders slump forward, deliberately ruining my normally perfect, rigid posture. I practiced making my hands tremble slightly, just enough to mimic the physical toll of overwhelming grief. I relaxed my facial muscles, letting my jaw hang slightly loose, and forced my eyes to look utterly vacant and lost. I stepped out of the car, dragging my tired feet across the wet cobblestones, leaning heavily on the grand front doors as I pushed them open. The grand foyer was brightly lit, the massive crystal chandelier casting a warm, inviting glow that starkly contrasted with the cold betrayal hiding within these walls. Derek and Monica were waiting for me in the main living room. The expensive catered reception had ended hours ago, and the massive house was hauntingly quiet. The moment they heard the heavy front door close, they hurried toward me, their faces twisted into masks of sickeningly fake sympathy. Derek reached me first, wrapping his arms around my slumping shoulders in a stiff, awkward embrace. He pulled away and looked at me with faux concern, his voice dropping an octave to sound soothing and gentle. "Dad, we were so incredibly worried about you. You missed the entire reception." "Everyone was asking where you were," he murmured, guiding me carefully toward the expensive leather sofa in the center of the room. I allowed him to lead me, shuffling my feet and staring blankly ahead. "I wanted to be alone at the cemetery," I whispered, making sure my voice sounded raspy, fragile, and weak. I just needed to say a final private goodbye to her. Monica stepped forward, her perfectly manicured hands clasping together in front of her dark designer dress. "Oh, Harrison, that is completely understandable," she purred, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "It has been such an exhausting, tragic day for all of us. Why do not you sit down and get some rest?" I slowly lowered myself onto the sofa, acting as though my bones were made of heavy lead. Monica hovered nearby, offering to bring me a cup of hot herbal tea to calm my frayed nerves. I nodded weakly, thanking her for her supposed kindness. But as she turned toward the grand kitchen, I kept my peripheral vision locked firmly on her. I watched her pause near the massive stone fireplace. She was not looking at the framed family photos on the mantel. Her eyes were darting rapidly across the high ceiling and the wide walls. I could see her quietly mouthing numbers to herself, her fingers twitching slightly as she mentally mapped out the specific dimensions of the space. She was actively measuring the living room for future renovations. She was already planning to rip out the dark oak paneling and replace the imported rugs the very moment I was safely locked away in the Pine Haven memory ward. She looked back at me clearly, assuming I was far too deaf, too tired, and too senile to notice her greedy, calculated behavior. I just stared at the floor, playing the role of the oblivious, broken widower to absolute perfection, while my blood boiled silently in my veins. I knew that any sudden movement or sharp look would instantly give away the burning rage I was carefully hiding behind my vacant stare. Monica returned a few short minutes later, placing a delicate porcelain teacup on the table directly in front of me. Derek sat down right next to me on the plush sofa. He sighed heavily, rubbing his face with both hands, as if he were carrying the weight of the entire world on his shoulders. He reached out and patted my back with a steady rhythmic motion. "Dad, I know it is a terribly hard day," he began, his tone dripping with practiced, rehearsed empathy. "But Mom would want me to step up right now. She would want me to handle the heavy lifting for you during this impossible time. You should not have to worry about all the tedious legal details when you desperately need to be resting and taking care of your fragile health." I kept my eyes fixed on the steaming cup of tea, waiting quietly for his ultimate move. Derek reached into his dark suit jacket and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of legal documents. He slid the crisp white papers onto the glass coffee table right next to the teacup, followed by an expensive silver fountain pen. "I just have some standard probate paperwork for you to sign, Dad," he said smoothly, his eyes flashing with hidden anticipation. "It just allows me to handle the funeral expenses and the basic banking tasks, so you do not have to stress about it at all. Just a simple formality." I stared at the thick stack of paper resting on the glass. I knew exactly what these documents really were. I knew that buried deeply within those pages was a sweeping power of attorney and a medical proxy that would end my freedom forever. The heavy silver pen gleamed brightly under the chandelier, waiting for my trembling hand to pick it up. I felt the cold, suffocating weight of my son's ultimate betrayal pressing down on my shoulders as he watched me with greedy, expectant eyes. Will I sign my life away? I stared at the white documents resting on the glass coffee table. The silver pen gleamed under the light of the chandelier. Derek sat perfectly still beside me. His breathing was shallow. His eyes tracked my every movement like a starving predator watching a wounded animal. I reached out with a trembling hand and pulled the stack of papers closer to my chest. I blinked rapidly, rubbing my eyes as if my vision was blurred by tears and overwhelming exhaustion. I slowly turned the first page. It was exactly what he claimed it was. A standard probate document authorizing the release of funds for the cemetery services. A routine piece of administrative paperwork. I did not stop there. I fumbled clumsily with the corners of the pages, letting my fingers slip, pretending my arthritis was flaring up in the damp weather. I slid the top pages aside, letting my gaze drift to the dense paragraphs buried deep in the middle of the stack. There it was. My heart turned to absolute ice. Hidden perfectly beneath the mundane funeral invoices was a sweeping, irrevocable power of attorney. Just 2 pages beneath that was a comprehensive medical proxy. The legal language was aggressive. If I signed those specific lines, I would be legally surrendering total control of my real estate empire, my bank accounts, and my medical autonomy directly to Derek. With a single stroke of ink, I would be handing him the authority to lock me inside the Pine Haven memory ward without a single legal hurdle. I let out a long sigh, letting my chin drop toward my chest. I closed my eyes tightly, forcing a heavy breath through my nose. I played the role of a broken widower pushed to the absolute brink of his physical endurance. "I cannot read all this legal jargon tonight, Derek," I whispered, my voice cracking perfectly. "My head is pounding. The words are just swimming together. I just want to go to sleep. I just want this terrible day to be over." Monica immediately stepped forward from the shadows of the hallway, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. "Oh, Harrison, do not strain your eyes," she cooed, her tone dripping with artificial sympathy. Derek already had the lawyers review everything. "It is just standard boilerplate language to protect the estate. You do not need to read it. Just sign where the yellow sticky notes are, and we will handle all the stressful details for you." I nodded slowly, acting entirely defeated. I reached out and picked up the silver pen. The cold metal felt foreign in my grip. For 40 years, my signature had been my bond. A sharp, aggressive script that had closed multi-million-dollar commercial property deals across the country. My signature commanded respect, authorized massive construction projects, and moved staggering amounts of wealth. Now I had to completely destroy it. I pressed the pen against the paper. I did not write my name. Instead, I allowed my hand to spasm violently. I gripped the pen awkwardly, like a child learning to write. I dragged the ink across the line, purposefully spelling my first name with 2 missing letters. I let the pen loop wildly on my last name, turning the letters into an illegible, chaotic scribble. I made sure the ink smeared slightly under the heel of my palm. I repeated this deliberate sabotage on every single page where a yellow sticky note pointed. I forged my own signature so poorly that no bank manager, no forensic expert, and no judge in the country would ever accept it as legally binding. I poisoned the documents right in front of their greedy eyes. I finished the final page and let the silver pen drop onto the glass table with a loud clatter. I slumped back into the leather sofa, letting out an exhausted groan. "Done," I murmured, closing my eyes and massaging my temples. "I am so tired, Derek." Derek did not even hesitate. He was so blinded by his own arrogance, so consumed by his desperate greed, that he did not even pause to double-check the signatures. He did not look at the misspelled name or the erratic loops of ink. He simply reached out and ripped the stack of papers off the coffee table, clutching them to his chest, as if he had just won the lottery. A wide, victorious smile broke across his face, destroying the grieving mask he had been wearing all evening. "Do not worry, Dad," he said, his voice suddenly brisk and full of cold authority. "I will take care of your money from here. You just go upstairs and get some rest." I pushed myself up from the sofa. I kept my head down, shuffling toward the staircase. I felt their greedy eyes burning into my back as I climbed the stairs, playing the part of the defeated old man until the very last second. I walked down the quiet hallway and stepped into my private study. I closed the oak door behind me. I turned the brass lock until it clicked securely into place. The exact moment the heavy door locked, my slumped posture instantly vanished. I stood straight in the dark office. My mind raced with clarity. I had successfully stalled them. The poisoned signatures would buy me a few precious days before the bank rejected the power of attorney, and Derek realized he had been played. But a bad signature would not stop them forever. They still had their corrupt doctor coming on Friday. They still had Beatrice waiting for the $12 million payout. I needed more than a delay. I needed irrefutable proof of their conspiracy to send them to federal prison for the rest of their lives. I slowly walked over to the window, looking out at the dark, sprawling grounds of my estate. I desperately needed a ruthless predator on my side, someone who operated deep in the shadows. Who can I call for help? I stood in the darkness of my study, the heavy oak door firmly locked behind me. The only light came from the pale moon filtering through the tall windows. I walked over to the towering mahogany bookshelf lining the far wall. I reached carefully behind a thick, dusty, leather-bound encyclopedia and pressed a small, hidden latch. A small section of the wood paneling popped open with a quiet click, revealing a steel wall safe. I quickly spun the dial, the metallic mechanism sliding perfectly into place. Inside, nestled next to a stack of emergency cash and an old revolver, was a cheap, black prepaid burner phone. I had purchased it years ago for sensitive corporate acquisitions, the kind of deals where absolute silence was a matter of professional survival. I pulled the small plastic device from the cold steel shelf and powered it on. The bright screen illuminated my hands. I punched in a phone number completely from memory. I did not need to look it up. It was a number I prayed I would never actually have to use. I pressed the green call button and lifted the phone to my ear. The line rang exactly 3 times before a deep, gravelly voice answered. The man on the other end did not say a word. He simply breathed into the receiver, waiting for the caller to identify themselves. "Mike, it is Harrison Cole," I said quietly into the dark room. There was a brief pause on the line. "Harrison." The voice finally responded, losing its rough edge. "It has been a very long time. Are you safe?" I told him I was physically fine, but that I needed his specific set of skills immediately. Mike was a retired corporate security contractor. Years ago, he ran a highly specialized private intelligence firm. He was the man you called when you needed corporate espionage neutralized or highly sensitive problems made completely invisible. But more importantly, Mike owed me his life. Decades ago, I quietly funded a massive experimental medical procedure for his young daughter when his insurance company abandoned them to die. I never asked for a single dime in return, and he swore an absolute oath that if I ever needed a ghost, he would answer the call. "I need a level 4 domestic sweep and wire," I told him using the old industry terminology. "I need military-grade hidden 4K cameras and ultra-sensitive microphones installed in my private estate. The living room, the main kitchen, and my private study. It needs to be completely untraceable, and it needs to happen tomorrow morning." Mike did not ask a single question. He did not ask why a grieving widower suddenly wanted to turn his own home into a surveillance state. He simply asked for my window of opportunity. I told him I would give him exactly 2 hours tomorrow morning. He confirmed and hung up the phone. The next morning, I slowly descended the grand staircase, playing the role of the exhausted, frail old man once again. Derek and Monica were sitting at the massive granite island in the kitchen, sipping artisanal coffee and acting as though they already owned the entire estate. I shuffled into the room, leaning heavily against the counter. Derek looked up, his eyes briefly flashing with that familiar, impatient greed. I reached into my cardigan pocket and pulled out 2 thick, gold-embossed envelopes. I placed them gently on the marble counter. I told them I appreciated everything they were doing to handle the estate paperwork. I said I wanted to thank them by giving them my exclusive VIP passes to the Bridgewater Country Club. I urged them to go have a lavish brunch, enjoy the spa, and take the entire morning off. I told them I just needed absolute quiet in the house to sleep. Monica's eyes practically lit up with unchecked materialism. Bridgewater was notoriously exclusive, and she had been begging for an invitation for years. They took the bait instantly. Within 20 minutes, they were dressed in their finest casual designer clothes and driving down the long driveway in their luxury sport utility vehicle. The very second their car disappeared completely past the heavy iron gates, a plain white utility van pulled smoothly into the circular driveway of the estate. Mike stepped out cautiously, carrying 2 incredibly heavy black Pelican cases filled with highly specialized surveillance equipment. He did not waste a single second with pleasantries. He moved through my house with the terrifying silent efficiency of a total professional. He swapped out the smoke detectors in the living room for identical units housing microscopic 4K lenses. He embedded audio transmitters inside the intricate crown molding of the kitchen. He placed a flawless, sweeping, wide-angle camera perfectly hidden inside the ventilation grate of my private study. He wired the entire estate flawlessly in an hour and 45 minutes, leaving absolutely no trace of his presence behind. Not a speck of dust, not a single wire out of place. Before leaving, Mike handed me a sleek, matte, black encrypted tablet. He told me the highly advanced feed was secured tightly behind a heavily encrypted multi-layered proxy server recording crisp audio and seamless video continuously to an impenetrable cloud. He patted my shoulder firmly, nodded once, and drove quietly away in his white van. I stood alone in the grand foyer, holding the black tablet in my hands. I tapped the screen. Crystal-clear, high-definition video feeds from my living room, kitchen, and study instantly filled the display. The audio was so sensitive, I could hear the grandfather clock ticking 3 rooms away. Suddenly, I heard the heavy sound of tires crunching on the wet gravel outside. Through the window, I saw Derek and Monica's car pulling back into the long driveway. I smiled, turning off the screen and slipping the tablet into my jacket. It is time to listen to the monsters in their natural habitat. The heavy front doors swung open. Derek and Monica stepped inside, looking refreshed from their luxurious morning at the country club. Their faces were flushed with arrogant satisfaction. I immediately forced my shoulders to slump forward, leaning heavily against the banister of the grand staircase. I raised a trembling hand to my forehead, squinting as if the ambient light of the chandelier was causing me immense physical pain. I let out a long, ragged sigh. Derek walked toward me, his face shifting into a mask of deep concern. He asked if I was feeling all right, placing a gentle hand on my arm. I told him my head was absolutely pounding. I murmured that the emotional toll of the funeral was finally catching up with my fragile body. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small orange prescription bottle, shaking it slightly so the heavy sleeping pills rattled inside. I told them I was going to take a sedative and lock myself in my bedroom until tomorrow morning. I begged them not to disturb me under any circumstances. Monica nodded sympathetically, urging me to get rest and promising they would keep the house quiet. I turned away from their fake smiles and climbed the carpeted stairs, dragging my feet with every single step. Once I reached the top landing, I walked down the hall and entered my master bedroom. I closed the heavy wooden door and turned the brass deadbolt until it clicked securely. I drew the thick blackout curtains, plunging the room into total darkness. I sat down on the edge of the mattress and pulled the matte black encrypted tablet from my jacket. I pressed the power button, instantly illuminating my face with the glowing live feed from the living room below. On the high-definition screen, I watched my son and daughter-in-law standing alone in the foyer. The very second they heard the lock click on my bedroom door, their entire demeanor shifted. The sympathetic expressions melted away completely, replaced by cold, calculating smirks. It was deeply chilling to witness how effortlessly they could turn their humanity off like a light switch. Derek loosened his expensive silk tie and let out a loud, mocking groan. He complained about how exhausting it was to pretend to care about my pathetic feelings. Monica laughed, a sharp, cruel sound that echoed clearly through the hidden microphones. She walked over to the plush living room sofa and kicked off her designer shoes, stretching her legs across the upholstery. Derek did not follow her immediately. Instead, he walked straight over to my private antique liquor cabinet. He bypassed the standard bottles and reached directly for the top shelf. My jaw tightened as I watched him pull down my most prized bottle of scotch. It was an extremely rare Macallan, a gift from a billionaire client that cost over $800. I had saved that specific bottle for decades, waiting for a truly monumental occasion. Derek cracked the seal without a single second of hesitation. He grabbed a crystal tumbler and poured himself a massive, reckless measure of the amber liquid. He took a long sip, letting out a satisfied sigh as the expensive liquor burned his throat. He looked around the grand living room, admiring the wealth that he believed was already his. I sat in the dark, watching my own flesh and blood desecrate my home with absolute impunity. Derek carried his crystal glass over to the sofa and sat down next to Monica. She was busy scrolling through her phone, probably looking at expensive imported furniture for the renovations she planned to begin once I was permanently locked away in the memory ward. She looked up at Derek and smiled brightly. She laughed loudly, telling him she could not believe how incredibly easy it was to fool the old fool. She mocked the way my hands had supposedly trembled when I signed the probate paperwork last night. She said I was already half dead and completely blind to what was happening under my nose. Derek chuckled, swirling the expensive scotch in his glass. He told her my ignorance was the greatest gift they could have asked for. He reached into his leather messenger bag and pulled out his sleek silver laptop. He balanced the computer on his knees and opened the screen. The hidden camera mounted inside the smoke detector captured the bright reflection of the screen, illuminating his greedy face. Derek quickly typed in his passwords, navigating directly to a highly secure financial portal. I watched the live feed, intently listening to the rapid clicking of his keyboard. Suddenly, Derek stopped typing. He leaned closer to the screen, his eyes widening with pure adrenaline. He let out a triumphant shout. He turned the laptop toward Monica, pointing eagerly at the digital dashboard. The life insurance adjusters had finally finished their review. The massive $12 million key person payout had just been fully approved and officially released into the primary survivorship trust. Monica let out a squeal of delight, wrapping her arms around Derek. They celebrated their fraudulent victory right in my living room. Derek set the laptop down and took another drink of my rare scotch. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling with unchecked arrogance. He smiled and announced his timeline. He said the funds were sitting in the holding account. I am initiating the wire transfer to Mom's offshore account tomorrow morning. He explained the money would become untraceable. Up in the pitch-black silence of my bedroom, a cold smile spread across my face. Derek thought he was a criminal mastermind, but his arrogance blinded him. He planned to use the power of attorney documents I signed to authorize the transfer. But the misspelled, forged signature I purposefully scrawled rendered his legal authority completely void. The second Derek clicked that transfer button tomorrow, he would commit massive federal wire fraud. But how do I execute this trap without letting Beatrice escape? I continued to watch the glowing screen of the tablet in the absolute darkness of my bedroom. The initial shock of the $12 million wire transfer had barely settled when Monica shifted her position on the sofa. She tucked her legs underneath her and looked at Derek with a sharp, calculating expression. She asked him directly about the timeline for the Pine Haven facility. My breath caught in my throat. This was the final, most terrifying piece of their twisted puzzle. Derek set his laptop on the glass coffee table and leaned back, lacing his fingers together behind his head. He told her there was absolutely nothing to worry about. He had already spoken with Dr. Aris. I knew that name. Dr. Aris was a highly compensated concierge physician who catered exclusively to the ultra-wealthy elite of the city. He was known for being incredibly discreet, completely devoid of moral scruples, and willing to provide any medical documentation required for the right price. Derek proudly explained to his wife that he had paid the corrupt doctor a massive cash retainer to handle my situation quietly. He said Dr. Aris is scheduled to arrive here at the house this Friday at exactly 10 o'clock in the morning. He will conduct a brief superficial evaluation, declare my father legally incompetent, and immediately sign the involuntary commitment papers. Monica smiled, taking a slow sip from a crystal water glass. She asked if they would experience any legal pushback from the state or from my personal attorneys. Derek laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound that echoed through the hidden microphones. He reminded her that the medical proxy I had supposedly signed earlier that evening gave him absolute, unquestionable authority over my healthcare decisions. He bragged that once Dr. Aris stamped the medical evaluation with his official state medical license, my legal rights would be instantly and permanently terminated. I would be physically transported to the high-security memory ward at Pine Haven before lunch. He promised her that the heavily sedated isolation would ensure I never spoke to a lawyer, a judge, or a financial investigator again. I stared at the tablet, a chilling realization washing over my entire body. I looked at the digital clock glowing faintly on my bedside table. It was Tuesday night. That meant I had exactly 72 hours left as a free man. 72 hours before a corrupt physician walked through my front doors, stripped away my fundamental human rights, and condemned me to a sterile, locked room for the rest of my natural life. If Dr. Aris signed those official medical papers, my vast wealth, my sprawling estate, and my very freedom would evaporate in an instant. I would be legally erased from society, treated like a ghost, while my own family spent my fortune. The sheer terrifying reality of their plot threatened to paralyze me, but I forced my mind to remain ruthlessly focused. I could not fight a signed medical order, a corrupt doctor, and two younger, desperate adults all by myself. If I tried to violently resist the medical transport. On Friday morning, my physical struggle would only serve as further proof of my supposed dementia and violent mental decline. They would use my righteous anger as medical evidence against me. I needed serious firepower. I needed a predator on my side who understood exactly how to navigate the darkest, most treacherous waters of the legal system. I turned off the encrypted tablet and set it gently on the nightstand. I lay perfectly still on the mattress, listening to the muffled sounds of Derek and Monica, eventually walking up the grand staircase and retreating to the guest suite at the far end of the hallway. I waited in the suffocating darkness for hours, listening to the heavy silence of the massive house until I was absolutely certain they were deeply asleep. The grandfather clock downstairs chimed softly, marking the passing hours as my mind meticulously organized my counterattack. At exactly 3 o'clock in the morning, I silently rose from the bed. I did not turn on a single light. I moved through the dark room with practiced precision. I walked to my walk-in closet and pulled a small, unassuming black leather briefcase from the top shelf. I carefully packed the encrypted surveillance tablet, the original charging cables, and the printed photographs I had taken of Beatrice's iPad at the rusted motel. I added a thick file containing my original uncorrupted estate planning documents and my authentic signature logs. Every piece of damning evidence I had painstakingly gathered over the last 48 hours went directly into that leather bag. I dressed in dark, unassuming clothing, moving like an invisible ghost through my own home. I gripped the handle of the briefcase, feeling the heavy weight of my family's impending destruction resting securely in my hand. I opened my bedroom door with agonizing slowness, wincing at the microscopic creak of the solid brass hinges. The sprawling hallway was completely dark and entirely silent. I crept down the back servants' staircase, bypassing the grand foyer entirely to avoid any chance of waking my treacherous son. I navigated the dark, cavernous kitchen, carefully stepping over the creaking floorboards I had memorized over the decades. I disabled the secondary security alarm with a silent remote fob and slipped quietly out the heavy rear door, stepping into the freezing, damp night air. The relentless rain had finally stopped, leaving a thick, heavy fog rolling across the manicured lawns. The cold moisture clung to my dark jacket as I hurried toward my vehicle, determined to launch my desperate, calculated counteroffensive. Where exactly was I sneaking off to at 3 o'clock in the morning? I started the engine of my car without turning on the headlights, letting the vehicle idle quietly before easing down the long driveway. I navigated through the thick, rolling fog that blanketed the wealthy suburban streets, driving miles away from my estate toward the gritty industrial outskirts of the city. I pulled into the empty, neon-lit parking lot of a 24-hour diner. The flickering red sign buzzed loudly in the damp night air. It was a completely anonymous, rundown establishment where nobody asked questions, making it the absolute perfect location for a clandestine meeting. I grabbed my black leather briefcase from the passenger seat and walked through the glass doors. The diner was practically deserted, smelling faintly of burnt coffee and stale grease. I walked past the empty counter and headed straight for a secluded booth tucked deep in the back corner. Sitting there nursing a steaming mug of black coffee was Tom Gallagher. Tom was a ruthless 70-something corporate attorney who had been my personal legal shark for over 3 decades. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, looking impossibly sharp and completely awake despite the ungodly hour. Tom was not just a lawyer. He was a brilliant, vicious tactician who specialized in dismantling hostile corporate takeovers and burying financial adversaries in inescapable legal avalanches. I slid into the cracked vinyl booth across from him, placing the heavy leather briefcase on the sticky table between us. Tom took a slow sip of his coffee, his piercing blue eyes locking onto mine. He did not offer any empty condolences about my supposedly dead wife. He knew me far too well to believe I would summon him to a greasy diner at 3 in the morning just to grieve. He simply placed his cup down and asked me what kind of war we were fighting. I unlatched the briefcase and pulled out the stack of printed photographs I had taken of the text messages on Beatrice's abandoned tablet. I slid them across the table. Next, I pulled out the encrypted surveillance tablet, powered it on, and loaded the audio and video recordings I had captured just hours ago in my own living room. I pressed play, letting the quiet, devastating voices of my son and daughter-in-law fill the space between us. Tom listened to the entire recording in absolute silence. He reviewed the photographs of the messages with surgical precision, analyzing every single word of their plotted insurance fraud, their money laundering conspiracy, and their horrific plan to lock me inside the Pine Haven memory ward. As the overwhelming evidence piled up, the hardened muscles in Tom's jaw tightened. His face turned as hard and cold as polished stone. He had drafted the original survivorship trust for my family years ago, and seeing his meticulously crafted legal documents weaponized for such a grotesque betrayal visibly infuriated him. When the recording finally finished playing, Tom turned off the tablet and pushed it back toward me. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his mind already operating 10 steps ahead of my treacherous family. He looked at me with a fierce, predatory grin and explained the absolute devastating beauty of the trap I had inadvertently set. He pointed to the recording where Derek bragged about initiating the $12 million wire transfer to the offshore account. Tom explained that because I had intentionally botched the signature on the power of attorney, rendering it entirely invalid and legally meaningless, Derek possessed absolutely no legal right to touch a single penny of those funds. The very second Derek sat at his laptop tomorrow morning and hit the transfer button, he would not just be stealing. He would be crossing a massive, irreversible threshold. He would instantly trigger a massive federal wire fraud alarm. He would be committing a severe felony across international banking lines using a forged authorization. Tom's voice dropped to a low, intense whisper as he laid out our precise strategy. He told me he would quietly contact his deeply embedded connections inside the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Financial Crimes Unit as soon as the sun came up. We would not try to stop the transfer. Instead, we would let Derek initiate the massive transaction, allowing the federal agents to digitally track the illicit movement of the $12 million in real time. We would establish a flawless, inescapable legal net that would capture my son the moment he tried to finalize his theft. The federal authorities would have undeniable time-stamped proof of his financial crimes, securing a guaranteed indictment that would send him to a federal penitentiary for decades. I sat back in the vinyl booth, feeling a tremendous surge of vindication. The legal mechanism was utterly flawless. Derek and Monica had confidently built their own gallows, and Tom was going to gleefully pull the lever. But as I absorbed the strategic brilliance of the federal wire fraud trap, Tom raised a single cautionary finger. The predatory smile vanished from his face, replaced by a grim, serious expression. He tapped his index finger sharply against the photograph of the text messages on the table. "We can completely crush Derek and Monica easily," Tom said, his voice hard and resolute. "They are amateurs playing a dangerous game they do not understand, and they will rot in a federal cell for their arrogance. But Beatrice is the true mastermind behind this entire operation. She orchestrated the faked death, the empty coffin, and the offshore accounts. If the federal agents raid your estate and arrest your son, Beatrice will instantly see the news and disappear into the wind with her fake passports before we can ever bring her to justice." Tom leaned closer, staring directly into my eyes. "We need to find exactly which luxury hole your dead wife is hiding in before Friday." Tom did not waste a single second. Right there in the dimly lit booth of that greasy diner, he pulled out his own secured mobile device. The digital clock on the wall read 3:45 in the morning, but in Tom's world, justice did not wait for normal business hours. He dialed a direct encrypted number that bypassed all standard federal switchboards. He was calling a high-ranking contact inside the Financial Crimes Unit of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, a man who owed Tom his entire career after a massive corporate corruption case a decade ago. Tom spoke in a low, authoritative voice, laying out the exact parameters of the impending wire fraud. He provided the necessary banking routing numbers, the specific survivorship trust details, and the forged authorization signatures. He instructed the federal agent to place a silent digital tripwire on the holding account, where the $12 million of life insurance money currently sat. "We do not block the transaction," Tom commanded, tapping his finger on the sticky table. "We let the son log in. We let him initiate the transfer. And the very millisecond the data packet hits the banking portal, your cyber team strips the routing path bare and tracks the destination internet protocol address to its physical, real-world location." The agent on the other end of the line agreed without hesitation. The digital net was officially cast. We sat together in the quiet diner drinking bitter coffee as the dark sky slowly began to turn a bruised shade of purple. The morning was coming, and with it my son's ultimate destruction. By 7:30 in the morning, the secure tablet sitting on our table buzzed with a direct message from the federal cyber team. The operation had commenced. Back at my sprawling estate, Derek had finally woken up. According to the digital logs now being actively monitored by the authorities, my son had connected to the high-speed internet network of my home. He had opened his web browser, navigated to the offshore banking portal, and entered his encrypted credentials. I could picture him perfectly. Sitting on the expensive leather sofa in my living room, sipping my rare scotch or drinking premium coffee, completely convinced he was the smartest man in the world. He believed he was pulling off the perfect crime, severing the financial tether to my legacy and seizing my wealth for himself. The tablet screen flashed with real-time data packets. Derek had just requested the transfer of exactly $12 million from the holding account to a heavily shielded offshore routing number. He clicked the authorization button, relying on the power of attorney paperwork he thought gave him absolute control. The forged signature I had carefully ruined the night before was attached to the digital request. The bank system processed the demand, but the federal tripwire was already actively working in the background. Instead of the money vanishing into a black hole in the Cayman Islands, the federal algorithm intercepted the handshake between the servers, capturing the digital packets of data and holding them in a suspended state. Derek thought the money was moving, but it was merely logging his undeniable guilt into a federal database. Tom watched the data scroll across the screen, his eyes narrowed in deep concentration. The offshore account was designed to be virtually untraceable, bouncing signals across multiple international servers to mask the identity of the beneficiary. But Beatrice was not a sophisticated international criminal. She was a greedy, impatient woman who wanted to monitor her stolen fortune from the comfort of a luxurious suite. The federal cyber agents noticed that the offshore account was actively being pinged by a secondary device, someone constantly refreshing the banking application to see if the $12 million had arrived. The feds traced that secondary communication signal directly back to a local internet service provider. The location was not the Cayman Islands. It was not a tropical paradise. The signal was pinging loudly and clearly from a luxury high-rise condominium complex situated right in the wealthy, beating heart of downtown Chicago. Tom received a secondary message containing the exact physical address and the specific unit number. Apartment 42B. The federal team ran an immediate property records search on the unit. It was currently leased under a newly formed anonymous shell corporation named Sapphire Holdings, which had been registered just 3 weeks ago. The timeline perfectly matched the inception of their disgusting insurance fraud conspiracy. Beatrice had never left the city. She was hiding in plain sight, living in absolute luxury just a few miles away, waiting for her son to deliver the final killing blow to my freedom. Tom locked the screen of the tablet and slid it back across the table. "We have her, Harrison," he said, a grim satisfaction lacing his raspy voice. "The federal agents are preparing the search warrants right now. By this afternoon, they will raid that downtown high-rise. They will arrest Beatrice for massive insurance fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. They will raid your estate simultaneously and take Derek and Monica into custody for attempted federal wire fraud and elder abuse. You do not have to lift another finger. You just need to step back, go to a safe hotel, and let the authorities completely dismantle this pathetic criminal enterprise." I stared down at the cold cup of coffee in front of me. The logical safe choice was to let the federal agents break down her door. It was the smart move. But logic and safety were completely irrelevant to the burning fire inside my chest. This was not a standard corporate hostile takeover. This was the woman I had slept next to for 4 decades. This was the woman who had smiled at me across thousands of dinner tables, who had held my hand during hospital visits, and who had quietly orchestrated my ultimate demise simply because she wanted a bigger bank account. I slowly shook my head. No. I whispered, my voice completely devoid of any warmth. "I am not letting the authorities handle her first." Tom frowned, leaning forward with a stark warning. "Harrison, do not let your emotions ruin a perfectly executed legal trap. If you go there and confront her, she might panic and try to run. She has fake passports. Do not risk it." I looked my old friend directly in the eye. "I am not asking for your permission, Tom. 40 years of marriage demands a face-to-face reckoning. I need to look into her eyes and see the monster she truly is before they put her in a concrete cell." Tom saw the absolute unyielding resolve in my gaze and slowly nodded, realizing there was no force on earth that could stop me. He told me he would delay the federal raid on the condominium by exactly 1 hour. I had 60 minutes to confront the ghost of my wife. I stood up from the booth, grabbed my heavy leather briefcase, and walked out into the cold, damp morning air. The sun was finally breaking through the thick gray clouds, casting a harsh, unforgiving light on the waking city. I got into my car and merged onto the busy highway, heading straight toward the towering skyscrapers of downtown Chicago. I navigated the complex maze of the downtown financial district, my mind rehearsing every possible scenario. My hands gripped the steering wheel with absolute purpose. I knew exactly what she was doing right now. She was sitting in a silk robe in her penthouse suite, drinking expensive champagne, eagerly refreshing her banking application, waiting for her $12 million to arrive so she could live like royalty. She thought she had won. She thought I was completely defeated, grieving her tragic death and preparing to be locked away in an asylum. I accelerated the towering glass and steel structure of her luxury building, looming over the intersection as a monument to her greed. What happens when a dead woman sees the husband she tried to bury? I parked my car a block away from the gleaming glass tower that pierced the morning sky. The storm had finally passed, leaving the city streets slick and washed clean, but a bitter, biting chill remained in the air. I stepped out onto the damp pavement, buttoning my dark coat against the wind. I stared up at the imposing structure of the luxury condominium complex. It was a fortress of wealth and exclusivity designed specifically to keep the rest of the world out. This was the expensive cage my wife had chosen for her magnificent vanishing act. I walked toward the grand entrance, my mind operating with the cold, mechanical precision of a ticking clock. I did not possess a key fob or a resident pass, but bypassing the heavy security of these elite buildings was simply a matter of patience and observation. I stood near a massive stone planter outside the revolving glass doors, blending into the morning shadows. I waited for exactly 7 minutes until a sharply dressed woman carrying a small designer dog and 2 shopping bags approached the entrance. The uniformed doorman hurried to open the heavy glass door for her, distracted by her demanding complaints about the morning weather. I simply lowered my head, adjusted my collar, and stepped smoothly through the revolving door right behind her. I matched her brisk pace, walking with the undeniable authority of a man who belonged there. The doorman did not even glance in my direction. I bypassed the opulent reception desk and walked directly to the bank of polished steel elevators. I stepped inside an empty car, the mirrored walls reflecting a man I barely recognized. My face was lined with age and recent exhaustion, but my eyes were entirely devoid of grief. They were dark, focused, and completely empty of the unconditional love that had blinded me for 4 decades. I pressed the smooth button for the 42nd floor. The elevator ascended with a silent, rapid efficiency, pushing me higher and higher above the bustling city streets. With every passing floor, I felt the final lingering remnants of my marriage breaking away, severing the invisible ties that had bound me to Beatrice since we were young. The doors slid open with a soft chime, revealing a plushly carpeted, immaculately quiet penthouse corridor. The air smelled of expensive floral arrangements and filtered luxury. I stepped out of the elevator, my leather shoes making absolutely no sound against the thick carpet. I walked slowly down the long hallway, reading the brass numbers affixed to the heavy mahogany doors. 40, 41, 42. I stopped in front of Unit 42B. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the polished wood grain. Behind this door was the woman who had shared my bed, birthed my son, and quietly orchestrated my absolute destruction. I raised my hand. My knuckles were perfectly steady. I knocked 3 times. The sound was sharp, heavy, and demanding in the silent corridor. I lowered my hand and waited. For a few agonizing seconds, there was nothing but silence. Then I heard the faint, muffled sound of footsteps approaching from the other side. I heard the metallic slide of a heavy deadbolt unlocking. The brass handle turned slowly. The door swung open. Beatrice stood before me, framed by the bright morning light, pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows of her penthouse suite. She was wearing a flowing emerald green silk robe. Her hair was perfectly styled, and her face was fresh and rested. In her right hand she held a delicate crystal flute filled with bubbling, expensive champagne. She had a relaxed, victorious smile resting on her lips, undoubtedly expecting room service or perhaps a delivery of luxury goods. Her eyes met mine. The reaction was instantaneous and profoundly violent. The confident smile completely vanished, wiped away as if it had never existed. Every single drop of color drained rapidly from her face, leaving her skin a sickly, terrifying shade of pale gray. Her eyes widened so far I could see the whites all the way around her irises. She stopped breathing entirely. Her fingers went completely numb. The crystal champagne flute slipped from her paralyzed grip. It fell in slow motion, crashing against the polished marble floor of the foyer. The delicate glass shattered into 1,000 tiny glittering pieces. The golden champagne splashed across the pristine stone and soaked into the hem of her expensive silk robe. She stood there, absolutely frozen, staring at me, as if the very gates of hell had opened in her hallway. She tried to open her mouth to speak, but her vocal cords refused to produce a single sound. Her mind was visibly fracturing completely, unable to process the impossible reality standing on her doorstep. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell. I did not lunge at her in anger. I simply stepped over the shattered crystal and the spilled champagne, walking smoothly past her into the grand sunlit foyer of the condominium. I turned around to face her, my posture relaxed, my voice dropping to a calm, conversational tone that was colder than the winter wind outside. "Hello, Beatrice," I said smoothly. "The funeral was lovely, though I have to admit the casket was a bit light." Beatrice remained pinned to the spot, her chest heaving as she desperately gasped for air. She looked wildly out into the empty hallway, frantically searching for the police, for Derek, for anyone who might be standing behind me. When she realized I was completely alone, a fascinating transformation occurred. The sheer paralyzing terror of seeing a ghost slowly began to recede. The initial shock wore off, replaced by the deep, toxic arrogance that had allowed her to execute this horrific plan in the first place. She closed her eyes for a brief second, taking a long, shaky breath to steady her racing heart. She slowly reached out and pushed the heavy mahogany door shut, the latch clicking with a sense of terrible finality. She turned back to face me. The fear was gone. A cruel, condescending smirk began to form on the corners of her mouth. She crossed her arms tightly over her silk robe, her posture shifting from a cornered animal to a venomous snake preparing to strike. What is her final excuse? Beatrice did not bother offering a tearful apology. She did not fall to her knees and beg for my forgiveness. She simply stepped away from the broken glass in the foyer and walked confidently into the massive, sun-drenched gourmet kitchen. She moved with an infuriating sense of ownership, completely discarding the sweet, devoted wife persona she had worn like a cheap costume for 40 years. She walked over to the sprawling marble island, picked up a chilled bottle of imported champagne from a silver bucket, and casually poured herself a fresh glass. She took a long, deliberate sip, letting the sparkling liquid calm her nerves, before she finally turned her cold, dead eyes back toward me. She let out a short, bitter laugh. "I suppose the incompetent groundskeeper finally grew a conscience," she said, her voice dripping with absolute disdain. I knew I should have paid that greedy fool the full 50,000 up front. You always were too lucky for your own good, Harrison. I stood silently in the center of the lavish living room, allowing her to speak. I wanted her to feel completely in control. I needed her to lower her defenses and let her overwhelming arrogance dictate her words. I asked her a single simple question. I asked her why she did it. Beatrice leaned against the marble counter, swirling the champagne in her glass. She looked at me not with hatred, but with a profound, suffocating boredom. Because I hated our life, Harrison, she confessed brutally. I absolutely despised our quiet, pathetic retirement. You built a massive real estate empire. You accumulated tens of millions of dollars, and what did we do with it? We sat in that giant, depressing house. We went to the same boring country club dinners. We lived like comfortable upper-middle-class retirees when we had the wealth to live like royalty. I did not want to spend the last good years of my life watching you read the Financial Times on the patio. I wanted to live in a sprawling villa in Monaco. I wanted to spend my summers on a private yacht in the Mediterranean. I wanted a billionaire's life, and you were far too conservative, too stingy, and too endlessly practical to ever give it to me. She took another sip of her drink, stepping away from the counter and walking slowly toward me. Her voice grew sharper, laced with a vicious cruelty that made my stomach turn. So I took matters into my own hands, she continued smoothly. I realized the only way to get the life I truly deserved was to trigger the $12 million key person insurance policy. But I could not do it alone. I needed an inside man. I needed someone with access to your corporate accounts and the legal authority to move the funds. She smiled a wicked, triumphant grin. That is where our pathetic, greedy son came in. I asked her how she managed to convince Derek to betray his own father. Beatrice laughed out loud, a sound completely devoid of any maternal warmth. I did not have to convince him of anything, she sneered. Derek is weak. He has always been weak. He was drowning in massive secret debts. He owed millions to private lenders to maintain that flashy lifestyle you refused to fully fund. I simply offered him a lifeline. I told him we could fake a tragic car fire, swap the dental records with a heavy bribe, and trigger the insurance payout. I promised him a generous cut of the $12 million if he helped me vanish and set up the offshore accounts. He jumped at the opportunity to steal from you. He did not even hesitate. Beatrice stepped closer, stopping just a few feet away from me. The smirk on her face hardened into a mask of pure, untouchable arrogance. She looked me up and down, completely unimpressed by my sudden resurrection. But the best part, Harrison, is that it absolutely does not matter that you figured it out, she whispered, her eyes shining with malicious delight. You are standing here completely alone. You have no proof. And by tomorrow morning, nobody in the world is going to believe a single word you say. Because tomorrow is Friday. Derek has already finalized the payment with Dr. Eris. He is coming to the estate to officially declare you legally insane. You are going to be locked away in the Pine Haven Memory Ward, pumped full of heavy antipsychotics until your brain completely turns to mush. You will tell the nurses that your dead wife is alive and living in a penthouse, and they will simply smile, strap you to a bed, and increase your medication. You lose, Harrison. You have already lost. I stood perfectly still, absorbing every single vicious, condemning word she spoke. I let her gloat. I let her lay out every meticulous detail of the insurance fraud, the bribery of the medical examiner, the manipulation of our son, and the horrific elder abuse conspiracy involving the corrupt physician. I let her dig her own grave with her own arrogant tongue. When she finally finished her cruel monologue, the room fell silent, save for the distant hum of the city traffic far below. I looked at the woman I had once loved more than life itself. I did not feel sorrow. I did not feel heartbreak. I only felt a cold, clinical satisfaction. I smiled slightly, a small, subtle upward curve of my lips that caused the triumphant smirk on her face to falter for just a fraction of a second. I slowly raised my right hand and casually tapped the top button of my dark wool coat. "You always did talk too much, Beatrice," I said quietly. Her brow furrowed in sudden creeping confusion. She stared at the button on my coat, her arrogant mind desperately trying to connect the dots. I did not give her the chance to figure it out. I turned my back on her and walked calmly toward the heavy mahogany door. I did not need to tell her that behind that small button was a military-grade live wire transmitting her entire detailed confession directly to Tom Gallagher and the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Financial Crimes Unit. I opened the door and stepped out into the plush, quiet corridor, leaving her entirely alone in her luxury cage. The trap was officially set. Friday morning arrived with a bright, piercing sunlight that completely washed away the dark gloom of the previous days. I woke up long before dawn feeling a profound sense of clarity and purpose that I had not experienced in decades. I showered, shaved with meticulous care, and dressed in a sharply tailored dark charcoal suit. It was the same armor I used to wear when I walked into the boardrooms of rival real estate developers to completely dismantle their empires. I walked down the grand, sweeping staircase of my estate, the house completely silent, except for the steady, rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the main hallway. I walked into the pristine kitchen and brewed a pot of dark, rich coffee. I poured the steaming liquid into a delicate porcelain cup and carried it into the massive living room. I took my seat in my favorite tufted leather armchair, positioning myself perfectly in the center of the room. I crossed my legs, rested my hands on the smooth armrests, and took a slow, calming sip of the bitter coffee. I felt absolutely perfectly calm. I was no longer a victim. I was the architect of their impending destruction. High above me, hidden flawlessly inside the smoke detectors, and the crown molding the military-grade cameras and microphones, were quietly recording every single second in brilliant, high-definition clarity. The trap was fully operational. I just had to wait for the rats to walk blindly into it. The antique clock chimed softly, announcing that it was exactly 9:30 in the morning. A few moments later, I heard the distinct heavy crunch of expensive tires rolling slowly over the gravel driveway outside. The faint hum of a luxury engine was abruptly cut off. I heard the sharp metallic click of car doors opening and closing. Heavy footsteps echoed on the stone porch. The brass handle of my grand mahogany front door turned slowly, and the heavy hinges swung open. Derek and Monica walked into the foyer, bringing the crisp morning air inside with them. They were dressed in casual but highly expensive clothing, their faces radiating a smug, victorious energy. They believed this was the very last day they would ever have to deal with my presence. But they were not alone. Walking closely behind them was a tall, unnervingly slick man wearing an impeccable designer suit. His hair was perfectly styled, and his eyes were entirely devoid of any human warmth. In his right hand, he carried a sleek, black leather medical briefcase. I knew exactly who this man was. This was Dr. Aris, the corrupt, highly paid concierge physician they had hired to legally erase my existence. Monica did not even bother to greet me. She walked right past my armchair without making eye contact, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floors. She disappeared down the long hallway toward my private master bedroom. A few minutes later, she reemerged, dragging 2 large, heavy suitcases behind her. She had already packed my life away into those bags. She left them standing near the front door, a brutal visual representation of my forced exile. Derek walked slowly into the center of the living room. He approached my leather armchair and knelt down so he was exactly at my eye level. He placed his hands gently on his knees, putting on a sickeningly sweet, deeply condescending smile. He tilted his head, forcing his voice to adopt the soft, soothing tone one might use to comfort a frightened, confused child. "Dad, we really need to talk to you this morning." Derek began, his words dripping with a rehearsed, artificial sorrow. "You are not well, Dad. Your mind is slipping away from you. You have been wandering the house at night, having terrible delusions. You have been hallucinating that Mom is still alive. We cannot safely take care of you here anymore. You have become a serious danger to yourself." He gestured toward the tall man standing silently by the doorway. "Dr. Aris is here to help us transfer you to a beautiful, secure medical facility where you will be safe, where you can get the constant intensive psychiatric help you so desperately need right now." Dr. Aris stepped forward, the expensive leather soles of his shoes squeaking faintly against the polished floor. He placed his black briefcase onto the glass coffee table directly in front of me. The metallic latches popped open with a sharp, terrifying click. He reached inside and pulled out a thick stack of official medical commitment papers, already stamped with his state medical license. Then his hand moved deeper into the dark velvet lining of the case. He slowly withdrew a long, sharp medical syringe. The plastic barrel was completely filled with a thick, clear liquid. It was a heavy chemical sedative designed to physically incapacitate me, so I could be dragged out of my own home without causing a scene. He held the needle up to the morning light, tapping the side of the plastic barrel with his manicured finger to clear a tiny air bubble. The ultimate, undeniable threat was right in front of my face. I looked at the long steel needle. I looked at the cold, corrupt doctor. I looked down at my son, who was still kneeling on the floor, waiting eagerly for me to surrender. I slowly reached forward and placed my porcelain coffee cup onto the glass saucer. The ceramic clinked loudly in the quiet room. The frail, broken, clueless old man they had been manipulating ceased to exist in a single defining instant. It was finally time to drop the hammer. I stood up. I did not struggle and I did not shake. I rose from the leather armchair with the rigid, powerful posture of a titan. I pulled my shoulders back and stood perfectly straight, towering over my son, who was still awkwardly kneeling on the expensive rug. The sudden, violent shift in my physical presence seemed to suck all the oxygen right out of the massive living room. I ignored Derek completely. I locked my eyes directly onto the corrupt physician. My gaze was absolutely lethal, burning with a cold, focused fury that made the tall man physically flinch. "Put that needle away, Aris," I commanded, my voice booming across the room with undeniable authority. "Put it back in your little black bag right now, or I swear to God I will personally make sure you never practice medicine in this country again." Dr. Aris completely froze. The smug professional facade shattered instantly. His hand trembled and he slowly lowered the dangerous syringe, his eyes darting frantically around the room as if looking for an escape route. Derek stumbled backward, scrambling to his feet. He was completely stunned. His greedy brain simply could not process the sudden, terrifying lucidity radiating from his father. The narrative he had built in his head was collapsing in real time. But his overwhelming arrogance blinded him to the danger. Derek clenched his fists, puffing out his chest as he took an aggressive step directly into my personal space. He pointed a rigid finger directly at my face, trying desperately to use his youth and size to physically intimidate me into submission. "Sit down right now, Dad," Derek shouted, his voice cracking with a mixture of fear and rage. "You are having a severe psychotic episode. You are not in your right mind. You signed the legal power of attorney documents. I am the legal head of this estate now. I am in charge, and you are going to the facility today whether you like it or not." I did not take a single step back. I stood my ground, leaning slightly toward my son. A cold, victorious smirk slowly spread across my face. I looked deep into his panicking eyes and began to meticulously dismantle his entire reality piece by piece. "I did not sign anything, Derek," I said softly, my voice carrying a devastating, razor-sharp clarity. "I purposely forged a sloppy, misspelled, completely fake signature on every single one of those pages you shoved in front of me. Those documents are entirely worthless. You have absolutely no legal authority over me, over this estate, or over my bank accounts." Derek blinked rapidly, his face contorting in profound confusion as the fatal reality of my words began to sink into his mind. I did not give him a second to breathe. I delivered the lethal blow, which means I continued, my smile widening into a predatory grin. "That massive $12 million wire transfer you eagerly attempted to push through to your mother's offshore account yesterday morning. The one you authorized using my name. That was a completely unauthorized, illegal transaction. You just committed massive federal wire fraud right inside my living room. All the blood instantly drained from Derek's face, leaving his skin a sickly, terrifying shade of white. His jaw dropped open, but no sound came out. He slowly turned his head to look at Monica. She was standing frozen near the front door, her hands covering her mouth in absolute horror. Derek stumbled backward, his legs suddenly weak. He finally realized that something was terribly, fundamentally wrong. He realized the old fool had set a trap, and he had walked blindly into the center of it. The suffocating silence in the room was suddenly shattered by the explosive, booming sound of heavy, violent fists pounding against the solid wood of my grand front door. The noise shook the walls of the foyer. A loud, commanding voice echoed powerfully from the other side of the heavy mahogany. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Open the door immediately. Before Derek could even turn his head toward the heavy mahogany entrance, the lock clicked open with a sharp metallic snap. I had disabled the deadbolt an hour ago. The massive double doors burst inward with an explosive, truly terrifying force. The heavy wood crashed violently against the foyer walls, rattling the framed artwork. Stepping right through the wide threshold was my trusted lifelong attorney, Tom Gallagher. He wore a tailored charcoal suit and a look of absolute ruthless satisfaction. But Tom did not come alone. Flanking him were 4 highly trained federal agents from the Financial Crimes Unit, dressed in dark tactical gear with heavy vests. They moved into my home with the rapid, coordinated precision of a military strike team, instantly cutting off any possible avenue of escape. The sheer physical presence of the federal authorities completely shattered the arrogant illusion of control Derek had built. The lead agent, a tall man with cold, unblinking eyes, marched straight past my trembling son. He ignored the 2 packed suitcases sitting by the door and walked directly toward the glass coffee table. Dr. Aris stood frozen, his manicured hands hovering above his sleek black medical briefcase, his eyes darting frantically. The agent did not hesitate. He forcefully grabbed the corrupt, panicked physician by the shoulder, spun him around with brutal efficiency, and slammed his chest against the wall. The sound of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around the doctor's wrists echoed sharply through the silent living room. The lead agent spoke in a loud, commanding voice that left absolutely no room for negotiation. "You are under federal arrest for criminal conspiracy, attempted medical fraud, and severe medical malpractice," he declared with mechanical precision. "Your medical license is currently suspended, and anything you say will be used against you in a federal court." Dr. Aris whimpered, his professional arrogance completely dissolving into desperate panic as a second agent searched his pockets and secured the dangerous sedative syringe as physical evidence. Across the room, Monica let out a piercing, hysterical scream. She stumbled backward, her designer heels slipping on the imported rug until her back hit the solid drywall. She slid down to the floor, pulling her knees tightly to her chest, her face buried in her hands as she sobbed uncontrollably. The glamorous, wealthy life she had callously envisioned building on top of my forced incarceration was collapsing into ashes right before her eyes. She tried to stammer out an apology, desperately claiming she had absolutely nothing to do with the legal paperwork. A female federal agent quickly stepped to her side and instructed her to remain perfectly silent and keep her hands visible. I turned my attention back to Derek. My son was completely paralyzed, his breathing shallow and erratic. He looked at the federal agents, then at Tom Gallagher, and finally at me. His mind was desperately searching for a loophole, an excuse to explain away the massive financial crime he had just attempted. He raised his hands in a pathetic gesture of surrender, his voice shaking so badly he could barely form a coherent sentence. "Dad, you have to tell them this is a misunderstanding." He pleaded, tears welling up in his terrified eyes. "I was just trying to manage the estate. I was just following the legal instructions Mom left behind. You have to tell them I did not mean to do anything illegal. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for the man standing in front of me. I raised my right hand and pointed a steady finger directly toward the high ceiling of the living room, gesturing toward the ornate crown molding. "Derek," I said, my voice cutting through the chaos with freezing clarity. "Did you really think I was completely clueless? Did you honestly believe I would just lay down and let you steal my life?" I stared deeply into his panicked eyes, ensuring every single word landed with maximum devastating impact. "Every single word you have spoken in this house for the past week has been recorded in brilliant 4K video and pristine audio." Derek stared at the ceiling, his jaw dropping in sheer, unadulterated horror. I continued my relentless dismantling of his lies. "I watched you pour my rarest scotch while you laughed at my grief. I listened to you celebrate the fraudulent life insurance payout. I recorded your explicit plan to bribe that doctor and lock me inside a memory ward for the rest of my natural life. The federal government already has every single digital file. Your entire conspiracy has been broadcast directly to the authorities since yesterday morning." The finality of my words struck him like a physical blow. Derek began to hyperventilate, his chest heaving as the walls of his inescapable reality rapidly closed in. The terrifying specter of a lengthy federal prison sentence broke whatever tiny shred of loyalty he still held. In a final, utterly pathetic display of cowardice, he decided to save himself by sacrificing his own flesh and blood. He pointed a trembling finger frantically toward the front door. "It was not my fault," Derek screamed, his voice pitching into a shrill, hysterical wail. "It was all Mom's idea. She forced me to do it. She planned the entire faked car crash and set up the offshore banking accounts. You have to believe me. She manipulated everything, and I was just following her strict instructions. You have to ask her. She is the one you really want." The living room fell hauntingly silent, save for Monica's quiet, desperate sobbing against the wall. The lead FBI agent, having just finished securing the corrupt doctor, slowly turned around. He walked deliberately toward my hyperventilating son. The agent stopped just inches away from Derek, towering over him. A grim, humorless smile crept across the agent's weathered face. He looked down at Derek with profound, unmistakable disgust. He adjusted his tactical vest and crossed his arms over his chest. "What does the agent tell Derek?" He looked down at Derek with professional detachment. His voice was remarkably calm, carrying absolute authority that echoed through my living room. "We cannot ask your mother," the agent stated, emphasizing every syllable so the reality could penetrate my son's panicked mind. "She was arrested at her luxury condominium exactly 1 hour ago. We breached the door just as she was attempting to destroy a tablet. The moment we placed the steel cuffs on her wrists, she did not defend you. She requested her lawyer and cut a plea deal with federal prosecutors by handing over every piece of digital evidence against you. She traded your freedom for a reduced sentence before reaching the holding cell." The magnitude of that revelation struck Derek with the devastating force of a physical blow. The mother he had conspired with, the woman he actively betrayed his father for, had thrown him under the bus at the first sign of danger. Derek's legs simply gave out beneath him. He collapsed heavily onto the Persian rug, his knees hitting the hardwood floor with a hollow thud. He buried his face in his trembling hands and began to sob uncontrollably. It was not the quiet weeping of a man facing consequences. It was a loud, hysterical, and pathetic wailing. The destruction of his privileged life had broken his mind. Across the room, the sudden reality of federal prison snapped Monica out of her paralyzed state. She looked at her groveling husband, then at the grim faces of the armed agents, and pure panic took over her body. She scrambled to her feet, her designer shoes slipping wildly against the polished floorboards. She turned her back on her husband and made a frantic dash toward the glass doors leading to the patio. An agent intercepted her path with blinding speed. He grabbed her firmly by the shoulders, spun her around, and pinned her arms behind her back. Monica thrashed wildly, screaming that she was just the wife, that she did not sign any documents, and she was a victim. The agent ignored her pleas, securing the handcuffs tightly round her wrists and reciting her Miranda rights. The grand living room, once a symbol of my family's immense success, had been transformed into a chaotic crime scene. Dr. Eris was marched out the front door, his head hung low in ultimate disgrace. Monica was pinned against the wall, weeping bitterly as cold steel bit into her skin. And there, in the center of the room, was my son. Derek crawled slowly across the rug toward me. His face was stained with tears and terror. He reached out with trembling hands, desperately grabbing the hem of my dark suit pants. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a begging desperation that completely disgusted me. "Dad, please," he choked out, his voice cracking violently between his hysterical sobs. "You have to stop them. You have the money. You have the best lawyers in the city. You can fix this. Please, Dad. I am your son. I am your only son. Please do not let them take me away. I will do anything you want. I will give everything back. Please save me." I stood perfectly still, looking down at the broken man clutching my leg. I searched deep within my heart, looking for even a tiny fraction of the paternal instinct that governed my entire life. I looked for the father who worked 80-hour weeks pouring concrete to ensure this boy never knew hardship. I searched for the man who paid elite tuitions and blindly bailed him out of financial disasters. But that father was completely dead. He died the moment I read those text messages in the rusted motel room. He died the moment I heard my son plotting to lock me inside a memory ward to rot. I did not feel a single drop of pity. I felt only the cold satisfaction of a permanent infection being surgically removed from my life. I reached down and firmly pried his trembling fingers off the fabric of my suit. I took a deliberate step back, severing the physical connection between us forever. I looked him dead in his terrified eyes, making sure my final words would echo in his mind for every night he spent in a federal cell. "You stopped being my son the day you decided my life was worth less than $1. I said, my voice devoid of any emotion. "You traded my freedom for a payout, and now you will trade your youth for a prison sentence." I turned my back on him. I nodded once to the lead federal agent. The agent stepped forward, grabbing Derek roughly by his jacket and hauling him to his feet. Derek kicked and screamed, a pathetic display of cowardice as the steel cuffs were ratcheted onto his wrists. He screamed my name over and over, begging for a salvation that would never come. I stood quietly near the fireplace, hands resting comfortably in my pockets, watching with stone-cold detachment as the armed agents dragged my sobbing son and his hysterical wife out the front doors. The heavy doors slammed shut behind them, cutting off their screams. The flashing lights danced briefly across the windows before fading down the gravel driveway. The massive house fell into a deep, haunting silence. Tom Gallagher stood quietly near the foyer, respectfully giving me a moment to process the devastation of my family tree. I looked around the empty living room. The fake, treacherous life I blindly funded for 4 decades was officially over. The criminals had been removed, the trap had been sprung, and I was finally safe. But as I stood alone in the absolute center of my fortress, surrounded by expensive art and imported furniture, a new reality began to settle over my shoulders. I was 70 years old, completely alone and in total possession of a vast financial empire. What happens to the empire now? The answer to that question began in the cold, sterile environment of a federal courtroom. Over the next 6 agonizing months, the relentless machinery of the criminal justice system ground my former family into absolute dust. I did not have to lift a single finger during the ensuing legal slaughter. I simply sat in the front row of the polished wooden gallery, wearing my sharpest tailored charcoal suits, watching quietly as my lifelong attorney went to work. Tom Gallagher was an absolute maestro of legal destruction. He operated with a terrifying surgical precision, systematically dismantling every pathetic lie and weak, desperate defense my son and his high-priced legal team attempted to construct. Tom ensured that the federal prosecution had every single piece of evidence neatly organized, perfectly authenticated, and completely undeniable. The high-definition audio recordings from my living room were played loud and clear for the presiding judge to hear. The digital logs of the attempted $12 million offshore wire transfer were displayed on massive flat-screen monitors for the entire courtroom to witness. The vivid photographs of the text messages from Beatrice's abandoned tablet sealed their collective fate forever. It was not a fair trial. It was a perfectly orchestrated execution. The formal sentencing phase was swift, brutal, and entirely without mercy. Beatrice stood before the stern federal judge, permanently stripped of her designer silk robes and her expensive flowing champagne. She wore a standard-issue drab orange prison uniform looking decades older than her 68 years, without her luxurious salon treatments. The judge stared down at her with absolute contempt, sentencing her to 10 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary for massive insurance fraud and deliberate identity theft. She looked back at me over her shoulder as she was led away in heavy steel handcuffs, but I simply looked right through her as if she were completely invisible. Derek faced the absolute harshest penalty of them all. The judge was visibly disgusted by his calculated plot to falsely imprison his own loving father in a locked memory ward for personal financial gain. My son wept openly, his tears falling onto the defense table as the heavy wooden gavel fell, sentencing him to a staggering 15 years in federal prison for conspiracy, attempted wire fraud, and aggravated elder abuse. Monica, who tried desperately to play the innocent, heavily manipulated wife, could not escape the recorded video evidence of her active, greedy participation. She received a solid 5-year sentence as a willing accomplice to the massive criminal conspiracy. Dr. Aris lost his prestigious medical license permanently. He was sentenced to 7 harsh years in a state correctional facility, his lucrative, corrupt career entirely destroyed by his own unbridled, pathetic greed. With the criminal element permanently removed from society and safely locked behind thick steel bars, Tom and I turned our focused, relentless attention to the massive financial cleanup. We spent weeks sitting in his quiet mahogany-paneled office, systematically resetting the vast, complicated foundation of my entire real estate empire. With the undeniable proof of their crimes officially entered into the permanent public record, Tom easily petitioned the conservative civil courts to legally dissolve the massive survivorship trust that Beatrice and Derek had so foolishly attempted to hijack. The $12 million insurance payout was immediately returned to my corporate holding accounts, safely secured behind entirely new, impenetrable layers of legal protection. We drafted new, comprehensive estate documents. I watched with profound, quiet satisfaction as Tom formally drafted the ironclad clauses that permanently and irrevocably disinherited Derek, Monica, and Beatrice from my last will and testament. They were legally and financially severed from my massive wealth forever. Not a single solitary penny of the vast fortune I had spent 40 long years building with my own bare hands would ever find its way into their meager prison commissary accounts. My sprawling empire was finally clean, entirely protected from the selfish, entitled vultures who had eagerly tried to pick my bones clean while I was still breathing. The brutal legal war was officially won, but the total victory brought a heavy, suffocating silence that I had never truly anticipated. I returned to my sprawling $4 million suburban estate, parking my luxury car in the massive empty circular driveway. The meticulously manicured green lawns were perfectly trimmed, and the grand stone facade stood tall and majestic against the darkening evening sky. But as I walked slowly through the heavy mahogany front doors, the sheer crushing emptiness of the massive house hit me like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. The grand sweeping foyer was dark and entirely unwelcoming. The opulent living room where Derek had arrogantly poured my rare scotch felt deeply contaminated by his treacherous presence. The pristine gourmet kitchen where Monica had coldly measured the walls for her selfish future renovations was completely devoid of any genuine human warmth. I walked slowly through the long, quiet, beautifully decorated hallways of my luxurious fortress, coming to a painful but necessary realization. Every single spacious room in this giant house was completely filled with lingering ghosts, and deeply painful, inescapable memories of a family that never really existed. The beautiful antique furniture and the expensive imported artwork meant absolutely nothing to me anymore. I had spent my entire adult life building this massive, opulent cage for a family that had actively and maliciously despised me. I stood entirely alone in the exact center of the grand living room, listening to the tall grandfather clock ticking loudly in the overwhelming, absolute silence. The rhythmic sound echoed off the high ceiling, serving as a constant reminder of the precious time I had wasted on people who never truly loved me. I took a deep breath, letting the cool, conditioned air fill my lungs as I stared out at the empty driveway. I was 70 years old, perfectly healthy, incredibly wealthy, and entirely alone in the wide world. How does a man start over at 70? You start over by completely burning the past to the ground. That was the only acceptable answer to the question echoing through the empty halls of my $4 million estate. I realized with absolute clarity that I could not spend another single night breathing the stale, contaminated air of a house entirely poisoned by profound betrayal. The next morning, I picked up my phone and contacted the most aggressive premium real estate broker in the city. I told her I wanted the massive property listed immediately, completely fully furnished, and aggressively priced for an incredibly rapid sale. I instructed her to leave every single expensive piece of imported furniture, every crystal chandelier, and every custom-tailored silk drape exactly where it was. I did not want to take a single physical memory with me. The sprawling suburban fortress was officially placed on the open market that very afternoon. It sold in exactly 1 week to a young, eager tech billionaire who was absolutely thrilled to acquire a fully furnished turnkey mansion. He wired the massive funds directly into my primary holding account without asking a single question about why the previous owner was leaving so suddenly. With the estate money officially cleared and the recovered assets safely secured in my personal accounts, I turned my attention toward a much greater purpose. I possessed an immense fortune that my former family had desperately tried to steal, and I refused to let that vast wealth sit idly in a bank. I worked closely with my legal team to establish a massive, legitimate, charitable foundation. I deliberately took exactly half of my entire immense fortune and securely donated it directly into the newly formed trust. The foundation was specifically designed to fund aggressive legal organizations and private investigative firms dedicated to preventing elder financial abuse. I wanted to make absolutely certain that vulnerable senior citizens who did not possess my resources or my fierce legal connections would never be thrown into a locked memory ward simply because their greedy relatives wanted a quick payout. I channeled my cold rage into a powerful, perfectly funded shield for the defenseless. It was the ultimate poetic revenge. The stolen millions my son and wife had callously planned to spend on luxury cars and European vacations were now actively paying the salaries of ruthless federal prosecutors and brilliant forensic accountants who hunted down people exactly like them. When the massive financial transfers were finally completed and the philanthropic foundation was permanently established, I prepared to physically leave the city that held so much misery. I walked into my sprawling master bedroom for the very last time. I ignored the vast closets filled with custom-tailored designer suits and the heavy wooden dressers packed with expensive luxury watches. I simply grabbed a single, unassuming black leather suitcase. I meticulously packed a few simple changes of clothes, a handful of essential personal items, and the incredibly important legal documents that represented my total freedom. I intentionally left behind the priceless modern art, hanging on the high walls, the beautiful luxury furniture, sitting in the grand living room, and every single remaining remnant of my completely fake family life. I zipped the small suitcase closed, carrying it lightly in my hand as I walked out the front doors of the mansion. I did not look back over my shoulder even once. I stepped into a waiting private car and headed directly toward the airport, leaving the heavy ghosts of my former existence permanently trapped inside that expensive stone cage. I flew south seeking warmth and absolute peace. I quietly purchased a beautiful, highly secure, incredibly modern beachfront property located on the pristine, sun-drenched coast of Florida. The new house was a flawless architectural masterpiece of smooth white concrete and vast sweeping walls of clear glass. It was completely surrounded by tall, swaying palm trees and protected by an impenetrable state-of-the-art private security system. There were no dark, hidden corners in this new home, and there were absolutely no memories attached to the pristine walls. It was a completely blank canvas where I could finally breathe without constantly looking over my shoulder. The interior was deliberately minimalist, furnished only with exactly what I needed to live comfortably and securely. I hired a private staff who respected my absolute desire for quiet solitude, and I settled into my new, deeply guarded life with a profound sense of total liberation. The brutal, suffocating winter storms of my past were permanently traded for the warm, gentle ocean breezes of my present reality. On my first evening in the stunning new house, I carried a single cup of hot black coffee out onto the expansive glass balcony. The warm Florida sun was just beginning to set over the horizon, casting brilliant shades of vibrant orange and deep purple across the vast, endless expanse of the calm ocean. The rhythmic, soothing sound of the crashing waves completely filled the warm evening air, washing away the lingering noise of the federal courtroom and the hysterical pleas of the family who betrayed me. I stood perfectly still against the smooth glass railing, feeling the gentle sea breeze rustling my hair. I looked out at the peaceful, shimmering water, realizing that the terrible, violent storm that had ripped my entire world apart was finally, truly over. I had survived the absolute worst betrayal imaginable, and I had emerged on the other side stronger, wiser, and entirely free from their toxic grasp. As I watched the sun dip below the horizon, I reflected on the dark journey that brought me to this beautiful, quiet shore. The distant past was nothing more than scattered ashes in the wind, completely powerless to hurt me ever again. My future was entirely my own, paid for with the heavy price of cold, hard truth. I took another slow, deeply satisfying sip of the dark, bitter coffee from my simple white ceramic cup. What is the final lesson I learned? The final lesson I learned did not come to me in a crowded boardroom, nor did it echo through the cold, polished halls of a federal courthouse. It arrived right here, in the profound, sweeping silence of this empty balcony, as the warm Florida breeze brushed against my weathered skin. I lowered the white ceramic cup, feeling the comforting heat radiating through my palms. I looked out across the vast, undulating expanse of the ocean. The violent, turbulent waters that had defined my previous life were gone, replaced by a steady, hypnotic rhythm that washed against the pristine white sand below. I stood perfectly still, allowing the fading golden light of the setting sun to wash over my face. The deep, heavy lines etched into my skin told the long, exhausting story of a man who had spent 4 decades fighting relentless battles only to face the ultimate betrayal in the supposed safety of his own home. Yet, as I breathed in the salty, crisp sea air, the heavy, suffocating weight I had carried on my shoulders for years simply dissolved. I was entirely alone. There was no wife to pour champagne for, no son to bail out of massive debt, no daughter-in-law to appease with extravagant, meaningless gifts. I was alone, but for the very first time in my entire adult life, my mind was completely and utterly at peace. The constant gnawing anxiety, the unspoken demands, and the hidden resentments were permanently gone. They had simply vanished into the salty air, leaving me free and revitalized. I looked down at my hands. These were the hands that had poured heavy concrete-framed steel and signed massive multi-million-dollar contracts. I had believed with absolute certainty that every single drop of sweat and every ounce of suffering was a noble sacrifice for the greater good of my legacy. I had foolishly equated financial provision with unconditional love, but staring out at the fading horizon, the harsh, undeniable truth finally settled deep within my bones. Wealth does not create loyalty, It only magnifies the greed that is already festering in the dark corners of the human heart. I turned my gaze, slightly speaking, not just to the empty ocean, but to anyone who might be walking down the same dangerous blind path I had traveled. Sometimes the people who share your blood are the first ones willing to spill it for $1. I spent my life building an empire for my family, only to find out I was building a cage for myself. I had constructed a prison made of solid gold and imported marble, locking myself inside with smiling wardens who eagerly counted the days until I took my last breath. They did not see a father or a husband. They only saw a walking, breathing bank account with an expiration date. They were more than willing to erase my mind and lock me in a sterile, heavily medicated room just to accelerate their inheritance and steal my wealth. The sky deepened into a rich, dark indigo, the first brilliant stars beginning to pierce through the twilight. I leaned my forearms against the smooth, cool glass of the balcony railing, feeling a profound sense of duty to share the hard-won wisdom I had paid such a terrible price to acquire. I realized that my story is not just a tragedy. It is a stark, urgent warning for anyone who chooses to ignore the subtle red flags waving in their own homes. We are conditioned to forgive our families infinitely, to make endless excuses for their disrespect, and to overlook their cruelty because we share a last name or a long history. But unconditional love should never mean unconditional tolerance for abuse. Don't ever let age or love make you blind to disrespect. If someone shows you they are willing to betray you, believe them the first time. Don't yell, don't cry. Build your defense in silence and then let them drown in the consequences of their own actions. Anger is a cheap, temporary release, but cold, calculated silence is an impenetrable fortress. I did not scream when I saw the empty coffin. I did not weep when I read those horrific text messages. I simply went into the shadows, gathered my ammunition, and waited for the perfect moment to completely dismantle their treacherous lives. The ocean waves crashed gently against the shore, a continuous, comforting reminder that the world moves forward, washing away the dirt, the lies, and the treacherous debris of the past. I took one final deep restorative breath of the clean ocean air, truly savoring the absolute, undeniable freedom that comes from completely severing toxic ties. I had lost a deceitful family, but I had fundamentally saved my own life. I had aggressively reclaimed my future permanently, ensuring that the remainder of my days would be lived strictly on my own terms, surrounded only by peace, objective truth, and genuine serenity. The sprawling, multi-million-dollar real estate empire I had intentionally left behind in the freezing streets of Chicago was absolutely nothing compared to the immense, immeasurable, and profound value of this quiet, uninterrupted evening. I stepped back from the pristine glass railing, feeling the cool, soothing evening shadow settle comfortably around my broad shoulders. I was finally ready to step back inside my quiet, perfectly safe home, ready to rest my weary bones, and ready to face tomorrow with an entirely unburdened soul. The journey through the darkness was excruciating, but the beautiful destination was worth every single scar I acquired along the way. Before I retreat into the absolute comfort of my new life, I want to leave you with one final thought. If you found satisfaction in my story, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments. What would you have done if the Gravedigger handed you that motel key? Stay sharp, and I'll see you in the next story.